select group today, and we're going to talk about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, a big partnership between the United States and Europe. And when last year President Obama announced this partnership in his State of the Union, and it was actually very well received. The Economist had it. It was a good idea with a very good chance of surviving more than only an announcement in the State of the Union. And am I still loud enough? The European Commission topped it very big. The European Commissioner for Trade, Karel de Gucht, noted it was the most successful commercial partnership the world had ever seen. So a lot of expectations. However, there's also a lot of criticism. It has been called by critics project for the corporal elite. Some even called it the ultimate lobbying exercise. Today we're going to talk about what this means and what we think about it. Before we do so, let me point out that there's a microphone in the audience. We welcome if anybody has questions. Please don't hesitate to ask it. You can also follow us on Twitter, hashtag RFD, or follow our own live tweets, RFD Live. And then I've got two guests, Donald Kreiken, my colleague, and me, are very proud to present. Ms. Roos van Os, she's researcher at the Stichting Onderzoek Multinationale Ondernemingen. Maybe do I have to translate this? The Foundation for Research for Multinational Corporations or Enterprises. And Tyson Barker, the Director of Transatlantic Relations at the Bertelsmann Foundation. Please give them a warm applause, and then we'll get started.
All right, welcome to Room for Discussion again. Ladies first, Mrs. van Os, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. What's new to this? We already get our Big Macs at the stores. Will this save me a penny on my Big Mac?
I think what's most important about, yes, to answer your question directly, probably it will save you a penny depending on the product you want to buy. But that does not involve any risk. So if you look at the financial crisis, for example, then of course, as a taxpayer, you might contribute to paying what might be a bailout and what I think is really important about this agreement is most FTAs, free trade agreements, the European Union concludes, are mostly about reducing tariffs. Of course, there are other elements, so competition law or procurement or patent law, but this trade agreement is not about tariffs or only minimally about tariffs, so a little bit in the food sector, for example, but mostly about regulation. So it's about non-trade barriers, non-tariff barriers, and and about global regulation. So the aim of this agreement is to create a transatlantic global regulation, and also because the WTO is not working at the moment, and they're not. So to round up, it's about non-trade barriers, and that's unique.
Mr. Barker, a partnership. What is different with a free trade agreement in a partnership?
What is the difference between the term free trade agreement and the term partnership? Well, to be honest, I think that the Obama administration just loves the word partnership. They use it in everything. But what she's saying is accurate. You know, the WTO was launched in 2005 to great fanfare. And the Dutch, in particular, are really big fans of multilateralism. But since that time, we've seen no agreements in the WTO. One round after another has been stuck in stalemate, and some people who would like to see greater integration of the global market at a high level of standards and regulations across the board have said we have to find alternative routes. So if we think of this, if the WTO is in the ashes, then out of the ashes has emerged several mega FTAs, which are currently being negotiated. The US has two, and the US, to be quite honest, sees itself as the swing state between these two big FTAs. One, which is Obama's number one priority, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's the plurilateral FTA with 11 Latin American and East Asian countries. And the other is the TTIP, which each one of these is a $4.5 trillion relationship already.
So these two are complementary trade partnerships?
Very much so, yeah.
Can we compare them to the trade agreement in Bali?
Well, so what happened at Bali was a very minor agreement on trade facilitation, on customs facilitation. But to be honest, the change in the normative behavior in the WTO is a direct reflection of these negotiations taking place. A lot of states that were a little bit recalcitrant, like Brazil, like China, in the WTO, see the fact that these other agreements are being negotiated and they might get left out in the cold. And that has made them more willing to negotiate with the US and EU on such issues.
Mrs. Van Os, a partnership also sounds a bit like a marriage. Is this a marriage between the US and the European Union?
The partnership used to be called TAFTA, so that's just FTA, yeah, the last sentences.
The Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement.
Yeah, so it's actually, I think, deliberately changed into partnership also for the public, because I think people on both sides of the Atlantic have been well aware that this is will be one of the most controversial agreements being negotiated for many years.
So just for context, TAFTA was started when, and when did it end? Maybe more interesting.
Yeah, I think you have to distinguish between formally and informally, because for many, I think almost 2 decades, there have been talks going on about convergence in regulation. Industry on both sides of the Atlantic have been very interested in this for many years. And I think maybe you know better, but I think in 2009, the first preliminary talks have started already to just see where can we go, what can we do. But now formally, in 2013, in March, the negotiations have really started after some kind of council who advised on this.
So we could say TAFTA was happening for 20 years, and then 4 years ago it got a new name.
No,
officially.
no.
Barker, no?
Everything that she said is accurate. I mean, the truth is that we've tried to launch this about 5 times.
Yeah.
And each time, because it's difficult, it hasn't succeeded. The political will hasn't been there. In 1990, there was the Transatlantic Declaration. You know, this was one of the big post-Cold War ideas. There were 2 big strategic ideas in the transatlantic relationship. One was NATO and EU enlargement, and the other was creating a transatlantic single market. So we did the one, but we couldn't do the other. We tried in 1990. They tried in 1995 with the new transatlantic agenda, which is where this idea of TAFTA emerged from. They tried a little bit in 2002, not really. Then Merkel relaunched this in the Transatlantic Economic Council in 2007, again with the idea of regulatory convergence. And one issue that came up, which was very controversial, was chlorinated chicken being allowed into Europe. And then the Obama administration launched the High-Level Working Group on Jobs and Growth. So there's a lot of technical bodies, a lot of different names for this, but basically we're talking about the same objective.
All right, so
sorry, what I wanted to say, I want to make one more point. I think the partnership came in because, at least in the European Union, as far as I know, this is the biggest PR machinery we've ever seen from the Commission. Because I'm working on trade for 5 years now, mainly on trade agreements with developing countries and the European Union. There hasn't been that much interest because people losing out of the interest of the developing countries in the European market is much bigger than the other way around. So the losses, if there are losses, they're mostly for people in developing countries. Right now, the impact will be on both sides. But in many ways, I think if you look at GMOs, if you look at the chicken scandal, if you look at financials, now maybe not financial sector, we'll talk about that later, but in many industries, especially agriculture, I think the weight and the interest is for the Americans.
So before we go into the controversies, what is the role for the Bertelsmann Foundation, for example, in TTIP? What is your role?
So our goal is very consistent with the Commission's goal and the U.S. government's goal, not in the sense that we have an outcome in mind, although we would like to see an agreement. But the sectoral controversies we're not a lobbying organization, we're a think tank and a convener. What we would like to do is foster discussion and debate. This, as people have rightly pointed out, transparency is going to be an issue. People want to be included. So our job as a think tank is to incorporate as many stakeholders as possible.
So the Bertelsmann Foundation just received a European Union grant for
Right.
opting a roadshow in the United States, so
Correct.
to promote or
It's not to, well, it's to inform. It's not to promote. Our goal is to bring together stakeholders at the local level in Europe, or in the United States, in different cities outside the Beltway. Because too often these discussions become limited to Brussels conversations or Washington conversations.
However, if I read the news flash about this award you've been handed, congratulations on that. It specifically said a roadshow that shows us the possible benefits of a trade partnership.
Yeah.
Isn't it strange that you're awarded money to show the benefits and not potential downsides?
We'll talk about both. I mean, what we will talk about, we'll focus on our studies, our studies are macroeconomic indicators of growth and jobs. But we will definitely have stakeholders from the consumer sector, from environmental NGOs, from different organizations. What we're going to be doing are TTIP town halls. And the point of a town hall is to bring everybody in and let them just discuss.
Mrs. Van Os, what is SOMO's role in all this?
We focus a lot on trade agreements. As I said, mostly with developing countries. My colleague is working a lot on the financial sector. So she says every effort you take to regulate the financial sector at the moment can be endangered by, if you look at the provisions in the current text, so the negotiating text. If you see, it's actually about disciplining regulation. Banks are also able to compete, to choose between different jurisdictions. So financial sector, and that's with the interest of making sure we do not have such a financial crisis and such a banking crisis as we had before. And the other is my interest and specialization is on investment treaties.
So we're speaking about interest here. You both represent certain interest or would like to provoke discussion. But if we look at this free trade agenda, you already mentioned this, since the Doha rounds of the World Trade Organization. Now Bali Agreement, minor, but the TTIP is a big fish. Seems to be momentum in the free trade agenda. Can you explain why this momentum has come about?
Why it exists? Well, from our side in the United States, when Obama was elected, he did not want to pursue a free trade agenda. He was very much about trade enforcement of current deals on the books. But when we're looking in the United States for areas of policy where he can build broad consensus, and I'm sure you guys are all aware that the political climate in the United States is very hostile right now. This is an area where there can be partisan consensus built, and particularly with Europe. Because even though there are differences in standards in environmental and labor standards, they're more or less equivalent. They're not the great variability you see in Asia. In Europe, you really have very limited policy tools at your disposal for coming out of the Eurozone crisis. So for example, on the fiscal side, because the fiscal compact really ties the hands of national governments, you can't use fiscal policy stimulus as a way of jolting economic growth. And monetary policy can't be used either because the ECB's mandate is so limited. So what you have at your disposal is trade. And so bringing in trade liberalization, especially with a large economy that's roughly equivalent in standards, is a good way to jolt that growth.
So if I rephrase this boldly, is this our only opportunity?
For the European Union?
To grow?
Well, to get out of the crisis. I mean...
There are a lot of policies that could be pursued, but this is a good way to start. It's definitely part of the solution.
And it's also, I think, political will. Eh? You see, like in the Netherlands and in many other European states, kind of a conservative way of approaching stimulating the economy. So looking outside, expanding the economy by growing and looking at trade seems for many, maybe not for myself, but quite naturally.
So are you saying that it's conservative and we're not really exploring other options? It's not the only option, it's just a conservative one?
No, it's not a conservative, but for people who do not want to stimulate the economy internally, it's quite naturally to look at trade for a solution. I hope, and I think, and my view is that it would also be good to look more internally how you can stimulate the economy and how you can maybe balance. Yeah, at the moment there's no political will. So it's not only that institutions do not allow you, but it's also that politically people do not have the view at the moment.
So to what extent is this really political? For example, the Bertelsmann Foundation had a survey saying that not the TTIP will be agreed upon in 2014, but 2016, the end of Obama's term. So this is more of a political thing. Do you agree? Do you think this is more political than economic?
Yeah, it's really a philosophical question, because in my opinion, economics is inherently really political, especially if people talk on a political level about the economy. But I think it's extremely political, and I think also negotiators and the European Commission underestimated the sensitivity of this agreement, especially because it is about regulation, and regulation is concerned with labor standards or with labor practices, with wages, with food standards, about how you treat companies, about the law system, rule of law. So there are so many political angles in this agreement that it is not just something which you can, with an economic view, conclude, and it will take a long time. I think indeed it is underestimated. The plan is to conclude it this year. It will by no way work. For example, right now it has said that till mid this year, July, they stop negotiating on one of the most important chapters, the investment chapter, because they say they want to consult society first.
This was in the news 2 days ago, right?
Yeah.
And Karel de Gucht, the European Commissioner of Trade, openly said that they will wait and conversate with society.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And indeed, that's quite good. It was one of our aims, and I think it's really, really good he does. But it shows, and it's an illustration that that they actually didn't think it through, that to what extent you have to involve society to think about it, and also to enhance democratic involvement of different sections, not only business but also different societal groups.
Mr. Barker, so coming forth also from her story, TTIP negotiations are very confidential. Why are they so confidential?
You know, there is I talked about our, doing these town hall meetings and how important it is to bring in stakeholder involvement and incorporate everybody. And I do think that's incredibly important. On particular regulatory issues, let's be honest, this is the heart of politics. This is where economics, social values, culture all come together, and they manifest themselves in these regulations. I think we would agree with that too, the United States. But we always talk about shared values. So hopefully we'll be able to come to some kind of convergence in some of these areas, not all of them, but some. But when you ask about the confidentiality of the negotiations, nobody ever asks that about the Iran negotiations. Nobody ever asks that about the coalition negotiations in Germany between the SPD and the CDU. Those all took place behind closed doors. What happens afterward is they're subject to democratic accountability through votes, and also the incorporation of elected officials. So I don't know why this line of argument comes only on trade agreements.
But is the democratic vote and conversation really there after this trade agreement is finished? Or
well, that's a question that people are validly raising. You need to make sure, not you, but the negotiators need to make sure that they're bringing in their democratically elected officials. Because if they're not satisfied, they will vote it down, right? It's happened before.
Yeah.
I think what I do want to add to that is, of course, there are reasons that it's better to negotiate in secret. But what should not be forgotten is that the texts are I think more than 100 or a few hundred people have actually seen the text. The texts are widely shared with industry associations, with business, and with a lot of stakeholder groups. They are leaked. There's a lot of gossip. We, for example, have most of the text already. So I think if you look... And also, a lot of trade negotiations are not conducted secretly. So the question is, why do they, for example, in the WTO, are the statements and positions of countries are fully open, and there's a democratic debate on that within the country itself. So our parliament goes to the ministry or to Ploemen of Trade and Development, and they say, I want you to take this position within the European Union when you go to the WTO, for example. If the trade agreement is concluded, for example, now with Colombia and Peru and the European Union...
Just if I can ask a quick question, because I'm kind of curious. With the system here, is that similar or analogous to our TPA system in the United States, where Congress votes for a mandate which is public?
But during the negotiations, this can be adapted a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, so indeed, there's a mandate in the beginning, but also during the negotiations, they can try to move a little bit one way or the other. Of course, this is kind of complicated.
Right.
But I do want to add, it's also highly risky that if you in full secret negotiate a trade agreement and you go back to Parliament in the European Union to 27 parliaments, and they can only vote yes or no when they don't have a clue what's actually in there and what will be the impact in the country itself. It will remain to be seen what will be the outcome. Right. I think there's a huge chance that one of the member states of the European Union will actually reject it, and there's no agreement at all.
So in a way, there are reasons for it being confidential, but then let us be honest about the numbers. The TTIP agreement seems to be very promising. The European Commission has just said that 119 billion euros will be delivered as a consequence of this agreement. It will massively solve unemployment. The Bertelsmann Foundation also has its own numbers. There are some doubts about this. Are you very certain about these numbers, and why?
Well, any of the numbers that are out there are always a thought exercise at the end of the day. I mean, you cannot predict fully what the interacting effects will be of, another global financial crisis, or China, or, a downturn in the developing world, or the price of commodities. But what these do point to is a trajectory and a magnitude of growth that I think we can be pretty confident in. For our numbers, the Bertelsmann Stiftung, our headquarters, did a study on Europe. I'm not as familiar with that study, but I can talk about our U.S. study. It showed that every state in the United States will grow, both in terms of job creation and in terms of gained exports. 33% increased exports and 740,000 new jobs. So I think, and the point that was brought up about, parliaments being brought in and maybe this leading to rejection, it's always a cost-benefit analysis. You have to weigh the costs against the benefits. And if that statement from earlier, our press release didn't mention costs, I don't want that to be the case. It's not going to be 100% win. There are trade-offs to be made. That's why these negotiations happen. They're very sensitive. That's why they happen in that context. But we present the package, or the EU and the US will present the package, and then the democratic bodies have to weigh whether the costs outweigh, or the benefits outweigh the costs.
But you do know that, in this case about America, that there will be big profits. However, I also read some data about this. There was a report that stated that European Commission own researchers stated that it would be a long-term growth of 0.1% in GDP, which is trivial, they noted. You don't think this is a possibility, that there will actually not be a big profit?
I'm not familiar with the study that you're citing, but I would guess, I have seen the CPER study, which I would assume is the commission-based study. My guess is that might be based on tariff reduction only scenario. Like I said, you can never say with 100% assurance that anything is is perfectly accurate when it's a prediction of completion. But you can look at those trend lines and see that this will be beneficial for the economy.
So you are saying, you already said it's not a 100% win. Free trade is not a free lunch, apparently. So there must be losers in this game.
Right.
And who are losing? Are these the biggest countries, the Portugal, Italy, Spain, Greece, the southern countries of Europe?
Yeah. I think, indeed, to answer your question directly, it will put enormous pressure on the internal market, this external competition. But to just go back to your previous question on economics, we haven't gone, and we don't have the resources and the knowledge to go into detail in what the cost and benefits are. We do look at specific sectors, so for example the financial industry. But what I want to say is, if you look at the way the European Commission presents its studies, it's only about enormous job growth. They go, what they present are the maximum predictions. So it's not something like, okay, it can be this, it can be that, but they go out and they give instructions to the member states on the national level to tell the best story, and not the story. Yeah, not a scenario where you have losers, where this can be low-wage work in different sectors that should be restructured for the course of 10, maybe 15 or 20 years. It's very difficult to predict. If you look at the economy for the last 10 years, nobody or almost nobody has foreseen what happened. If you look at 1.0 or even less impact, and look at what happens, the growth of China, other BRICS countries, I think they're trying to create wisdom and selling this agreement by growth and jobs, while in the end it's just not able to say so clearly. And besides that, it's the study did take into account regulation also. So it's not only about tariffs, but the study commissioned by the European Commission is also about regulation.
Well, they had two scenarios. So they had one scenario which was a slimmed down scenario that was a tariff-only scenario, and then they had one that was tariff and regulatory, the comprehensive scenario. So they did both. So in that way, they have addressed both a mini package, which would just be tariffs only, traditional FTA, and what they're trying to do, which is a new type of agreement, a more single market area agreement.
So to finish my point, one of a critical academic said the best way to know what the impact of a FTA will be is look at previous FTAs. So what has been done is they looked at the previous the impact, for example, of NAFTA on the US.
The North Atlantic Free Trade.
Yeah, and
between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, right?
Yeah, and it was also, at the time, previous to conclusion, sold with these huge predictions on job growth. But if you look at the real impact, and probably you know the facts and the figures better than I do, there are job losses every year due to this restructuring. American firms go to for low-skilled and low-wage labor to Mexico.
I see you sort of frown when she remarked this.
Is this true for Portugal, Italy, Spain?
I respectfully disagree with that. We did have an impact of the liberalization and the outflow of certain jobs, but it wasn't to Mexico, actually, it was to China. And it wasn't a result of NAFTA necessarily. Actually, NAFTA and the single market are the basis for the Bertelsmann Stiftung IFO study, which is available in English. This was done in Germany, looking at the historic trends of job growth and export growth in the single market from 1992 and NAFTA from 1994, and it showed even more growth than our study. So there are job gains to be had. That study also demonstrated that every Southern European state will grow. What I will say is there are losers. There are sectoral losers and there are relative losers. And it's the job of public policymakers, and I can give the example of the United States, to address this. That's the job of policy. So what we do in the United States is we have something called trade adjustment assistance, which basically acts as an equalizer of the welfare gains. So for the jobs that are displaced because of trade agreements, there are jobs retraining programs.
I don't know if I understand this right. If because of NAFTA, Texas doesn't profit as much as Washington State...
Texas did great, actually.
Yeah, I understand, but okay, it's just an example.
Yeah.
If Texas did less than Washington State, some of the profits from Washington State would be
redirected.
Is this, in short...
Yes, in the most basic way of phrasing it, that's what happens. It's a form of physical transfer.
So
I know. Yeah, this is really a more general point, and I'm not. Maybe you are more aware of all the, as an economist, as all the statistics. But in Davos, for example, for the third year in a row, there was. They do this kind of risk assessment. What are the biggest risks in society endangering stability? And it says inequality for the third time in a row. Not only because consumers do not actually have the money to buy products, because of course poorer people do spend a higher percentage of their income to buying stuff, but only because of also because of political stability. I think what you see in the European Union, but also the Arab Spring, is not only.
But maybe it's.
I like the idea of policymakers redistributing the gains of free trade, but at the end you see inequality rising for the last 30 years in most states of the world.
But is there a plan within, for instance, the TTIP, the partnership, to redistribute among the world, for instance?
So Asian countries, the
to shift money to countries that are not included in TTIP?
Because you would say this.
That's a very provocative and interesting question. There isn't. I guess people would say the role of government, the social contract that governments have first and foremost is with their own citizens. So what they have to account for are the displaced, the losers of trade within their states.
Yes.
Or in the European Union, maybe within the European Union.
So the Asian countries, according to a Bertelsmann Foundation study, are losing because of TTIP. Should we compensate these countries? China, for example?
Well,
Japan?
that study actually didn't take into account the accommodation factor. So how will these states change their behavior in order to accommodate new rules of the road? I mean, one of the big geostrategic selling points, as you guys know, of TTIP is in 20 years, China is going to be a larger economy than the US and Europe combined. And in order to continue to have our role to set standards at the level that we would like to see, we need to join forces.
Mrs. Van Os, is it not frightening? Are we not, with the US now, going into a partnership against the rising China? How would China respond to this, for example?
Actually, they have responded, and they say, yeah, if there are better rules, we also benefit from it. So I'm not sure. I do think multilateral agreements are much better, and if China loses out, I think they can manage that. But I think you also have to look at poor countries losing out. Or really poor countries who have less power and instruments to their disposal to actually compensate this.
Are the developing nations looking at these negotiations? Do you know about that? Are they looking at it with fright, or are they looking at it?
Actually, I don't really know. I cannot imagine differently because a lot of studies show there will be some kind of trade diversion. So actually, it will be more difficult for other countries to export to the European Union and United States because of better convergence and non-trade barriers between these blocks. But I'm not familiar with individual reactions of states.
Let's see, we have a question.
Yes, hello. Thanks so much for coming. I have a question for Mr. Barker. I understand that the Bertelsmann Foundation is, as you said, here to inform about the good stuff and the bad stuff of TTIP. But it's remarkable that I've only really heard good stuff so far, which is jobs and growth. Could you tell me what's the bad stuff?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of the Bertelsmann Foundation. Let's just start there. So we've done studies that look at job growth and export gains. So we haven't gone into the sectoral issues. I will point out one thing that is of concern for the United States, for example, which they would consider a bad thing. But this is a value call for you guys to make. Or they see the European Commission and the City of London trying to use TTIP negotiations as a means to reopen Dodd-Frank, our new bank regulation. And they look on that with worry because they don't want to have some of these very hard-fought regulatory battles in the post-crisis time relitigated.
That's the only bad thing?
Let's see.
Because if it's all good, why haven't we done so yet? There's got to be more stuff.
You know, I'll be honest with you. When you're talking about regulators, they guard their autonomy very viciously. They see their role as guardians of safety and health as very important. And that's also part of their job. You know, they have jobs. So when you're talking about approaching, streamlining regulation where outcomes are the same but the processes might not necessarily be the same on, any number of issues. Take cars, manufacturing, if the tests is different here than there or whatever. Then they're really entrenched. It's hard to dislodge entrenched independent regulators. It requires buy-in from many stakeholders. That's why it's so difficult. It requires a lot of political will. It's tough.
Maybe we'll get some frowned upon subjects later on in the... Let me first ask, because you were explaining that the numbers and the way it's promoted by the European Commission doesn't really take into account intersectoral differences, and maybe also, I was wondering, does it show us, or is it possible to show us what a common household would profit from this? We started with the Big Mac question, it might be cheaper. Are households going to earn more money? Are there estimations of this?
The official estimation is 545 euros a year.
Yeah.
But then that's based on, that will be in 2027, and it will be not corrected. So it's the current, it's the current level. But if you take into account different estimations, it can be, it lies between 1 or 2 cents a day in 2027, because they say it will take at least 10 years to 12 years to go into maximal effect.
Yeah.
And I think it's really necessary to look at the risks also. For example, we talked about this, but I think financial risks, so these huge bailouts, one of the problems with the financial crisis has been deregulation. This is a great agreement on the financial sector about deregulation. Both sides of the Atlantic industry are hooking up to see how they can downsize regulation, which poses enormous risk. If you look at the deficit of the Netherlands, it has been increased by billions and billions due to this financial crisis, which has to be paid by taxpayers. If you distract that from the possible gains, and this is only in one sector, so and I haven't heard that anywhere in any calculation.
So if you have problems highlighting the downsides and you listen to the financial regulation story, you also already know that the tariff scenario and the more strong liberalization scenario, I suppose this liberalization scenario takes into account financial liberalization as well.
What they do is, it's kind of complex, but what they do is estimate the cost across sectors of, as a tariff, a proxy variable, of how much are non-tariff barriers, how much can they be translated to if they were a tariff. So some sectors like automotive, where supply chains are very complex and you're sending around a lot of things, or chemicals, or financial services, how much does that equate to as a tariff equivalent? Then they add those all together and then they slice it. So what they do is, across the board, they assume our study assumes a 25% reduction in non-tariff barriers to trade. Yes. That's a comprehensive scenario, 25% reduction.
Can I ask something about that? Does it mean that 25 means 1 out of 4 regulations will be cut or not?
Well, it doesn't necessarily mean cut. It could mean something like, take a car or a toy. I mean, do you trust yourself when you drive in the United States?
Yes,
that's a question. Do you trust, and these are valid questions to ask. Do you trust the food of the United States? Because if you're asking about negatives, I don't have an opinion on these things because these are sectoral, but I will raise them because they're controversial. People say, well, I'll just...
Okay, well, my first thought is, would I trust myself with the financial sector in 2009? Well, I would
Valid
say
question.
maybe not. Maybe yes, maybe not.
Right.
If we liberalize, would I trust them more? I doubt it.
Well, the Europeans are the ones who want to liberalize the banking sector,
So
actually.
maybe we should listen more to the Americans. But will the overall result be a more regulated or a more deregulated financial market?
I reject the premise of the question, and the reason is because and this is if we take the negotiators at their word, and maybe we don't, but if we do, then they say we will not end up with outcomes that lower regulation. We're trying to eliminate duplicative regulation. Right. So does everything need to be checked twice? Is there more interoperability between the systems? The example everybody uses, and this is never going to happen, but you go to the United States, you have your iPod from here or whatever, you can't plug it in. You know, why should we have different standards for plugs? These are historical outgrowths of regulatory regimes, but why do we have these? Do we have to have these?
So another thing.
I do agree. Like I think the example of the cars, safety rules on cars, very, very important, of course, but also these plugs. It's one. I think a lot of people will actually agree there are like dozens and dozens of rules and regulations that there's no sense.
Could be matched.
Yeah, that could be matched, and it's not. Maybe it's a little bit controversial, but not. It's profiting big business instead of small business. But anyway, it probably will be good. But the discussion should be about these hundreds and hundreds of rules in food regulation, where actually maybe people say, what is the difference? But the big question and the most important question is, do societies have the democratic control to make their own rules? Or should that be in a trade agreement where there's no possibility for individual states to opt out? And I do not have a really, really strong opinion, for example, on GMOs, but a lot of my friends have.
Genetically modified organisms, so this is the American food.
And if you go into the discussion on GMOs, I think as an outsider you get lost, but it's very, very controversial, and a lot of things are unknown. And right now, GMOs are regulated in the European Union by the precautionary principle, which says you have to think about risks in advance and take these risks into account. While American food companies, and also, should not be forgotten, European food companies, are pushing for the scientific approach as opposed to this risk assessment approach. And they say there has to be scientific research and scientific evidence to make for these GMOs to be not risky. So it's turning the evidence around.
All right, Mr. Barker. Yes.
Sorry, one point.
Finish your point.
Without going into detail, you have to ask, what can the Dutch, are the Europeans on state level, on European level, at European Parliament, are they democratically allowed to choose which approach they want? If you go for the approach currently being negotiated in the trade agreement, maybe they're excluded. That can be the case. But it's not the interest of the industry. Then there's no possibility to choose for not labeled, but also for non-GMO food.
All right. That is indeed a very important critique. And it reminds me of something which is also at stake in the TTIP negotiations, which is called the investor-to-state dispute settlement. Could you explain what this is and why this is a risk?
This is actually her area of expertise, so she would probably be better to jump in at the beginning. But basically, and correct me if I get anything wrong,
ahead.
but it is the idea that an investor, a company, can bring a state to a tribunal, an independent tribunal, which I believe is run in conjunction between the bank, the World Bank, and the UN. But,
yeah.
In the case where changes in law lead to losses for the company, so take the example that first comes to my mind is a nationalization. So if my company invests in Argentina in something like a mine and it's nationalized, and my country that I'm based in has a bilateral investment treaty that includes ISDS, I can take Argentina to this tribunal to seek restitution, monetary restitution for that. It's like a hedge.
So what is at risk here? For example, if we look at environmental regulation, socio-economic regulation, would these firms, these investors be able to do the same?
There are, the critique that I've heard, and I'm sure you can speak to it much more, in much more detail, is that it could be a way of undermining the democratic process. And I wonder about that, but what I would say is with the United States being the kind of litigious legal environment that it is, it would probably lead to more court cases being lodged.
Can you maybe explain why it's such a threat to democracy?
Sovereignty?
Yeah, the current models of investment agreements are totally outdated. It's a pre-war colonial system in a like communist era where indeed European companies, it originates from Germany and Pakistan, where the European companies were afraid, or the governments were afraid, that they were being nationalized, indeed. Right now, it's indeed a system where companies can sue the government without actually going through national courts first. So they can go directly to privatized law system where there are 3 lawyers who are private lawyers who decide on claims for losses due to certain policies, but also future losses. So it's not real actual losses, but also maybe future losses. I think there are a few examples which show the most controversial issues. It's on cigarettes packaging in Australia and Ecuador. So there's a mailbox company, Philip Morris has a mailbox company in Singapore suing, for example, Australia for regulating health by saying we don't want any trademarks anymore on the packaging.
So we would say it's logical that a state would act against smoking because it's bad for your health, and then Philip Morris can act against the state because they have a trade agreement.
Yeah, they can sue the state directly into this tribunal. And what also there are some of these cases are transparent, they're open, but some are not. So we actually don't have a clue how many cases there are in the world. They're known 500 cases, 62 in the last year, most from US companies to others. But for example, the Netherlands is the second. So there's 50 companies, mostly mailbox companies, suing other states, sometimes their own states. So they incorporate in the Netherlands to sue their own government.
So do you think there's a risk Holland is going to get sued?
Yeah. As he said, the claim culture in the United States is totally different from Europe, and especially also, of course, the Netherlands. And for example, Chevron, but also other companies have put their whole lobby budget into lobbying on the investment chapter of the agreement. So this shows some of the interest these companies have. They look, for example, at fracking. So it's really controversial.
Because you earlier on noted that you wonder if there are really big risks with this chapter.
Well, I mean, I think that it's open for debate. I am not an expert on ISDS, and the idea of reforming it seems to make sense to me, or open to a debate on reforming it. For instance, the truth is that in the current ISDS regime globally, Germany has like 100 bits with so many countries. The Netherlands probably does as well. You can use third-party countries to, as she said, use corporate subsidiaries based in Hong Kong or wherever to already pursue these kind of cases. So right now, a U.S. company, Philip Morris probably, could already do this process with the Netherlands. Doesn't matter if it's in the TTIP or not. That regime is already built. Whether we should re-examine this regime is totally open for question, but it already exists.
Are there alternatives posed?
Will TTIP make a difference in this?
Maybe it could. Maybe we could look at this as a model for redressing this.
I think that the European Union actually does at the moment. I've been involved with SOMO lobbies the Dutch government for modernizing their bids to take more social and environmental issues into account. And the European Union helps us with this, because actually they say we want to modernize the investment chapter with the US.
Right.
And because it also shows an alternative for the outdated investment treaties of the Netherlands. So in that sense, I think increasingly, because bid cases are there, so many, it's increasing a lot in the last year. So everybody sees the system has to change.
So where are we heading? So we have US standards, we have European standards. Are we merging these standards and are we heading towards best practice? Or are we actually in a race to the bottom with the TTIP agreement?
What I think is extremely important, which shows this a little bit, is on the investment, that the reason they want this in the TTIP, the investment chapter, is they explicitly say if we do not put it in there, we have normal rule of law countries with good, well-developed law system. It's not necessary to have it in here, but we want it because otherwise we cannot have it with China. And we want this because otherwise we cannot have it with Brazil in the future.
So we should set a good example.
Yeah, you cannot, and this, I think this agreement in total shows it wants to set a standard of free trade, deregulated free trade for the world. And in that sense, that's not, I think it does pose a lot of risk, especially, regulating to the bottom.
So you don't agree with this?
No, I don't agree at all, no.
You, Mr. Barker, do you think this is best practice example?
I hope so. I mean, I think that nobody's looking to have a race to the bottom. I mean, anybody who says that is ridiculous. That's not what we're looking to do. These two economies are very similar and facing very similar economic trends. And recognizing those and using each other, forging an alliance, an economic NATO of sorts, could help us perpetuate our standards globally in a time when we won't be able to. We are negotiating a bit with China right now, as are the Europeans. We've gotten a lot of concessions on that bid as a result of TTIP and TPP with the Chinese. So that's good, to open up more sectors.
So we should already see movement.
Yeah, but if I can bring one case in, and this is pretty speculative, but I'm just going to give you an example of why a bit, including this idea, the ISDS, might be something to consider in Europe. In Greece, we have a very likely scenario that Syriza might win the next election. And if they pursue nationalizations, then companies that have invested there, both European and American and others, might want to pursue restitution for that. I think the Europeans might be able to through the ICJ already, or the ECJ?
Yeah. That's within Europe, that's possible already. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Which is an ISDS in some ways.
But then a public, transparent, and democratic.
Those are things that maybe we should address.
Maybe the ISDS is the investor-to-state dispute settlement system, right? So this is the regulatory dispute settlement system.
So I think this is a conversation that we need to have, and that's what we're doing.
So these TTIP negotiations have actually been going very fast, rapidly, since last year, July. But you already mentioned Karel de Gucht wants to involve the public more. There seems to be a halt on this. Has the NSA scandal also delayed TTIP negotiations?
Well, officially no. But let's be honest, it's affected public perception enormously, particularly in Germany. That's the truth. And addressing this, not just in tone, but also in substance, is very important to the Europeans. I mean, the truth is, for us, the United States, e-commerce is a big part of our growth, and also one of the only areas that the U.S. has a current account surplus. That's where our exports are bigger than our imports. I mean, how many people in this room are on Facebook or use Google or use Amazon or eBay or whatever? The truth is that's all facilitated by an agreement called Safe Harbor. And that agreement is under scrutiny, intense scrutiny by the European Parliament and by the Germans. And this has to do with the NSA scandal.
Yeah, and I think in Europe, the European Parliament has since Lisbon, it has bigger powers and on trade, and they're using these powers. Also, they're threatening a bit the Commission on NSA, for example. They say if the member states and the United States does not cooperate on providing more transparency on NSA issues, we will not agree and proceed with the trade agreement.
I see we have a question.
Yeah, but I like the NSA subject so much, so I thought I'd
Been waiting.
Yeah.
Do you have a specific question?
Yes, I just had an idea. Of course, NSA, I don't want them to listen to my telephone calls. I'm a Dutch citizen. And that would be really helpful if they treat us respectful and according to the golden rule that you treat people as you want to be treated yourself. But I just had an idea. It's about going metric. In the United States, you have all this old-fashioned system of yards and feet and thumbs and other body parts and miles, and it doesn't calculate very nicely. So it would really help the United States of America, the people in the United States of America, to go metric with kilometers and meters. And even in England, they managed to do that. So. It would be really helpful also for the European companies to sell products in metrics and to build aircraft. So would be a good idea, really helpful for the world if you put in there that everybody goes metric.
Is this a possible outcome of the TTIP agreement?
What I would say is at the retail level, i.e. what people talk about and kind of intuit when they think about all these things, this was a fight that happened in the 70s, and, you know, Americans tend to be pretty set in their ways. But I think on the wholesale level, it may be something like aircraft. These are things that will be considered. In scientific standards, we've already moved much more towards metric. In the, you know, any kind of product that you're selling not to the retail market but to a wholesale market or larger, I think that's definitely possible. I mean, I'm not in the room negotiating these things.
This is confidential information.
It's a good tip.
Metric system is confidential information.
Yeah, I don't know. No, I think it's a good idea. There will be public consultation of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands on TTIP next month. So I'll bring this in.
So we come back to politics again. In the European Union, we have elections coming up, and there's quite some skepticism. A while ago, also the U.S. Senate voted against IMF reforms. Do you think TTIP is actually politically feasible?
I think it will be extremely difficult, and the reaction of the Gucht to have this view of like almost 5 months hold on investor chapter negotiations has to do also with the political climate at the moment. I know from other political processes, the Commission, as well as other institutions, they're extremely afraid for this nationalistic backlash there is in general, which also, of course, threatens the economic model of the European Union. So I have the idea that they just want to survive now the elections as good as possible and then see further. So I don't expect a lot till June, and then of course after summer it will be September. I'm not familiar enough with the political dynamics within the US to know. Maybe there are other things coming up later this year which makes it difficult. Of course, in democracy you have every year you have certain processes where people can actually speak. Out loud.
Take an eye on it.
Yeah.
Mr. Barker, you wrote an article. This time it's different.
Yeah.
Is that true again?
Well, I hope so. I mean, every other time it hasn't succeeded, but, you know, we are coming to the end of where we can really have the biggest bang for our buck as far as setting regulatory standards globally. But on the political side, I'll talk a little bit about the United States. We have an election this year as well. Trade is a very sensitive topic in election years. And the authorizing legislation that is going to approve this negotiation to go forward is tied to the same authorizing legislation that's doing Asia. And that is extremely controversial. So we're going to have a couple of sensitive months, and there are a lot of things that need to be worked out in that debate. But and I could go into all sorts of issues, market access on autos in Japan and rice and yada yada. environmental labor standards, TAA, the adjustment assistance.
So this is the next few months are going to be controversial around the TPP. Right.
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We had a very nice session today. TTIP is promising, but there are some questions about it. We will see in the coming months, maybe years, maybe in 2027, what this will mean for our Big Mac.
We'll come back here and talk about that.
We'll be back. I would like to thank you all as an audience for listening. Please note that next week we will not have a session due to exams, but the week after we will have a session on pension system, especially the Dutch system with Frits Bos and I think Lars Duursma from Kempen & Co. Dijkstra, sorry. Lars Dijkstra, my apologies. For now, please, thank you everyone. Thank our guests, Tyson Barker, Roos van Os, SOMO. See you next time.
Thank you.
Sorry, one more thing. I took a little bit of propaganda. So if people have interest in reading some of the critical remarks on this, you can take one of these papers here.